Welcome to the Remoter Podcast, where we explore the universe of remote work and life through conversations with seasoned experts and influential leaders. Our aim is to uncover valuable insights and best practices you can use to build high-performance remote organizations. Today, we're talking with Joy Sybesma, founder and CEO of Scalejoy. Joy has over 15 years of experience managing various people operation functions across companies. She currently helps companies in hypergrowth build customized solutions to scale their culture. And I've personally worked with Joy to create frameworks and processes around people, culture, leadership. This conversation came about because Joy and I were catching up, and she was telling me about the great work she's been doing since the pandemic, and most recently with leaders across the planet to help them lead better in the remote world. I hope you learn and enjoy this conversation with Joy. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm here with Joy Sybesma. Did I pronounce that right, by the way? You've told me multiple times.
Sybesma, but it's okay.
No. Let's get it right. It's super important.
It's Sybesma, like the horse, Seabiscuit.
Sybesma.
Yeah,
Sybesma.
yeah.
Yeah.
Dutch. I know it's hard.
Dutch. Dutch are great. Um, So I'm super excited to be here with Joy. Joy and I have an ongoing situation where we get into these great conversations, and they're about business, about companies, about remote. And we've always said it would be great to get this knowledge out into the world. And finally, we're here doing it. Joy is the founder and CEO of Scalejoy, where they help companies that are growing, scaling their leadership capabilities. And Joy has been helping companies, businesses, startups with everything having to do humans, right? From chief of people to human resources to now how do you scale leadership and do leadership in the remote world. And that's what caught our attention. That we were having this deep conversation, and Joy mentioned that she was doing all of this great work with companies all over the planet, with people all over the place, helping them to do leadership well in a remote environment. And I'd love to learn as much as there is to learn about this topic from Joy, from you today. Anything that I missed in that intro that you'd like to bring up?
No, that was great, Tomas. And I just feel so lucky to be in your circle, and I learned so much from you. And I'm just really pumped for this conversation.
Likewise. So, Joy, talk to us about what you've been up to. And since the pandemic and leadership, and what you found as a gap in what we're doing and what companies are doing from a leadership perspective. What have you been up to?
So I started my company right in the middle of COVID. I started it in 2020, and I started it from my shed converted to an office in remote Pennsylvania. My husband and my kids and I had moved out there from New York City in the middle of COVID. And so I really feel like I feel such a passion for remote work because I founded my company that way. And I set out to achieve this mission of helping companies scale their leadership in a totally unique point in time, right? Where companies who had been in person were suddenly remote. Companies who'd been remote forever were like, finally, everybody else is getting a taste of this new world. And since then, so since 2020, you start a company thinking, well, it'll be remote for now. And it's actually become an organization that still primarily the majority of our work is done remotely. And I have two employees, and one I've never met even in person, even though we've been together for a year and a half. The other one I've happened to have met two times because my travel took me to the place where she lives. But it's been really an amazing journey in how you can start and build a company and have remote employees, but also support companies across the entire globe, from your computer. So we've been doing that for about 3 years now, and we've learned a lot about what it looks like to manage and lead in a remote environment. Still learning every single day, though. So I'm excited to talk because every time I talk to you, I come away with something else that I want to be thinking about.
That's so good. And Joy, in all this work that you've been doing, you were telling me you were doing these seminars and you were helping leaders. Well, what do you think is the biggest difference between when we used to lead in an office when we were in person versus now where we're leading in the remote world, and with a big asterisk that even what remote means to different companies is different, right? Some companies have overcompensated by going into Zoom meetings for 4 to 8 hours every single day, and some companies have said, we're going fully asynchronous and we're never going to see each other live, and everything's going to be either a text message or a Loom or an email. So what are you seeing are the biggest difference between in person to the remote world?
Well, I feel like in person led to a lot of lazy managers. And what do I mean by
Oh.
that? I think that there was the ability to tap someone on the shoulder, forget about your person until you saw them sitting across from you. So, and I hear this from a lot of managers of like, it was just so much easier to manage when we were in person. And I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, but I think that you need to be so much more intentional now with ensuring that you're actually creating the right space, that you are, leading with psychological safety, that you're managing your energy and your time. So I think the word I would say is the biggest difference is like the intentionality that managing remotely requires, and having a system that works for you, works for your team, works for the company. And when I say system, I mean everything from like what systems do you use? How do you where do you write things down? What time of day are you online? Like I think just everything needs to be a lot more intentional and maybe even explicit, versus like subjective and organic. What do you think?
Well, first thing that comes to mind is that when we worked with you,
Hmm.
and understanding some of these things that we were absolutely missing at the time, that was so helpful. Like in documenting what is our one-on-one framework, how do we give feedback, how do we put that into our documentation for our organization, um, how do we prepare for these meetings, who should you be meeting with? That was so helpful when we worked on that together. And I think you're spot on. There is a big difference. Laziness, I don't know. I have to digest that. I think that we were just comfortable with it,
Yeah.
right? And I think the system just naturally rewarded people that could organically take all these signals and lead that way. And of course, we had good managers and bad managers, micromanagers and managers that just didn't care and just wanted to leave as well.
Totally.
Um, but it was easier to do a lot of those things organically because you just saw and felt when people came in, the tone of their voice throughout the day, how often they were coming in and out. Are their eyes red, or what's happening, or are they super excited, or people are clapping coming out of a conference room? So you were able to get all of these signals that now you're right, it's about being very intentional, because unless you're intentional about creating systems that allow you to get some of those things that we're missing now, you're not going to be able to lead as effectively as you used to be able to do for free-ish,
Hmm. Hmm.
with air quotes, right? What do you think about that?
Yes. And I think the systems that managers are figuring out, it's one of the biggest hacks I feel like in my work is that every time I work with a company and I work with managers, I learn a lot about what people are doing. And I feel like we're all in this kind of great experiment together. And, there isn't exactly like a leadership book that you can read right now that
No.
was published before all of this happened that actually can give you the how to guide. So collectively, I feel like with every conversation, I'm learning new ways that managers and companies are adapting to this, and even like like stand-ups and the idea of a stand-up and how different managers are approaching the concept of a stand-up, right? And so even like, okay, I'm going to do a daily stand-up with my team, but it's just for camaraderie. It's just to get that
That's right.
read on like how people are feeling, how people are doing. So I'm so amazed by the adaptability and the new systems that people are putting in place to do exactly what you were saying, like to be able to stay connected and to feel like they can read their team and know what they need in a given day. So it's really fascinating.
Get a little bit of that humanity in some
Yes.
way, because
Yes.
otherwise, yeah, and getting that intentionally. Yeah, I moved from doing, I remember the days of big corporate Fortune 50 and in-person startups, San Francisco. and everywhere in the world, we used to just get together, and whether
Yeah.
we were doing waterfall or agile or whatever, it was a lot of meetings. And then even the stand-ups, it was a lot of reporting. And I think the beauty right now is that we can play with asynchronous and synchronous, but then when we're doing the synchronous side is how do we actually do that for exposing ourselves to our shared humanity. And that's, I think, I'm happy. I think I'm the happiest right now with our stand-up framework
Mm-hmm.
that we have right now. And so, yeah, it's constantly evolving, as you said. We're just learning every day.
Well, and that piece
Yeah.
about humanity, I feel like if we can figure out how to utilize async communications to do almost all of the reporting and all of the information that needs to be shared so that you can have just really quality connection when you actually are. And I think you used the quote with me another day around conversations, not meetings, right? But you can actually make them conversations. And that's, I think, the biggest trend I'm seeing, Tomas, is that like every manager I work with feels like they have too many meetings. And yet they're all kind of waiting for their companies to do something about it. And then they kind of realize through the conversation that they actually have a lot that they can do about it. And so it's like, but it's this new skill set, right? Of like documentation and async communication. And I don't think we're doing enough to equip people with like the new expectations of how to thrive in a remote environment, but also how to lead through that. And I think if we could get people thinking more of that way of what are all the things that happen outside of the meeting to make meetings conversations and conversations that are meaningful, that would be amazing. That to me feels like kind of the next step. What do you think?
How do you do that? How do you, because I hear that a lot from leaders as well, whether they're managers that have a lot of reports, C-suites, that their teams are drowning in meetings, and managers, for example, one-on-ones, right?
Yep.
They have, let's say they have a healthy number of reports, they have 12 to 15 reports. All of a sudden, they have 15 one-on-ones a
Yeah.
week that they have to prep and execute. Hopefully, they're
Yes.
doing half an hour meetings, but it
Yes.
still means that they have 12 to 15 hours maybe of one-on-one time per week, plus then everything else that they're doing in projects is meetings. So how do you work with, or do you recommend, or do you have a framework or tips on how do you get out of that meeting fatigue cycle of death?
Yes. It is a cycle of death. I have a few tips. So, one thing I love to have managers do is get into a ritual of every Friday ask themselves the question, who needs me the most next week? And this is kind of a parallel of getting their needs met and not burning out, as well as being really like cognizant of how they're going to spend their time. And so, in that asking that question of who needs me the most next week, does my calendar reflect that? So, for example, maybe it's a big product launch happening next week. The product managers are going to need me the most next week because there might be bugs, they're going to be under a lot of pressure. And does my calendar reflect prioritizing them? Maybe it's my kid's first week of school next week. Actually, my kid needs me the most. Well, if I have back-to-back meetings the whole week, how am I going to pick them up from the bus at 2:30 in the afternoon? So I think there's like a mindset around prioritization that I think can happen first. Second thing is every Friday in my off ramp of the week, I look ahead to the week and I say, it's kind of a game. I'm like, can I find an hour back? And it's a mentality. And I found that, and you can practice this later and tell me if it works for you. I have found that if you challenge yourself to look at your week ahead and say, is there at least 1 hour of meetings I'm planning on attending that does not need to be a meeting or that I do not need to attend? I've never once not been able to find an hour back. I think there's a bit of like a mindset shift and a system around looking ahead. Then one-on-ones, I'm a big believer in one-on-ones. However, my mind has been shifting a little bit lately around the rigidity
Huh.
of a one-on-one. Yes, yes,
Yes,
this is what I
yes.
mean. I feel like this time is there's just so much expansive thinking. So I think about myself. So when I was an employee before I started my own company, um, I was a high maintenance employee. Like I wanted time with my
Yeah,
boss as much as I could get because I
yeah.
liked thought partnership, I liked feedback, like all those things. So my boss could say, we're going to meet an hour a day. And I'd be like, thank you. I'd be so excited, right? No matter what. When I was in a C-suite job, I remember I worked for a president of the company who was so busy and had so many things going on. And we had just like low quality one-on-ones every week. And so we finally both were like,
Yes.
this isn't working, right? This isn't working for either of us. So we decided to do 1 2 hour one-on-one a month. And it had to be when we were both at our peak. We were both morning people. So we did a 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. one-on-one once a
Yep.
month. And we got more done. We built more trust in that one-on-one than we had for the 2 years leading up to it doing weeklies. So I think there's an opportunity to really examine like what does each person need from a one-on-one, and do they have to be an hour? Do they have to be weekly? I feel like tenure matters in that question. I think trust and the communication styles matter. But you know, I've worked with a lot of pretty introverted individuals who actually like really like don't like to just have to make small talk with me, you know, for an hour every day. So I have one person who we really focus on, like we write a lot to each other and we communicate via text. We do that kind of thing. So I think that one-on-ones, there's an opportunity probably for managers and employees to look at their calendars and say, is this one-on-one structure working for me, or where can I make adjustments so that my calendar is not overwhelmed with one-on-ones? So
I like that a
prioritization,
lot.
mindset, and one-on-ones, just some early
Yeah.
thoughts on that.
I like your take on having some flexibility there. I think part of this is giving ourselves the opportunity to evolve, to
Yes.
question even what we've been doing in the past 3 years, the books that we've read. It's different, and we also can reserve the right to change our minds. And I like that you gave me permission, because that's kind of what I've been doing, and I would have hated to just to admit it, but I like the idea of having all these one-on-ones and as reminders. But what I end up doing is also I take notes if I have feedback for somebody. Many times I just give it to them, because I do believe in transparency. I think we
Yes.
save a lot of brain cycles if you don't have to think about this one thing that I wrote down that I have to pull up that it's been
Totally.
bugging me all week. And then many times it can be more positive time if we need it. And many other times, if I'm working very closely with somebody, we can be like, hey, do we have anything super important for our one-on-one, or should we skip? Do we feel like we're good? And giving ourselves that permission for those times that we can really be present and there's something important to talk about. So I
Totally.
like that idea. Yeah.
Yes, and two thoughts on that. One is I recently was doing a big training for an organization that has people all over the world, and one of the managers basically said, "I don't do one-on-ones," and it was very controversial. He was with 50 of his peers who were like, "What do you mean you don't do one-on-ones?" And he said, "Yeah, I stopped doing all of them. I have 25 people in my reporting structure." Because I want them to come to me when they need me, and I want them to have space to find me when they need me. And he's like, if I have one-on-ones scheduled every single week recurring, there's no space for ad hoc.
Yeah.
And he said, so you're going to go into my calendar and say, does this guy even work? In reality, he's like, I'm actually working on whatever people need from me in that moment in time because I have space for it. So I just love that in theory, right? Of like the idea of just repositioning so that you're available when people need you. Another thing though, go ahead. Yeah.
No, no, no. I just the meta conversation that comes to mind is that so many leaders and so many companies are being completely reactive because they just have so many things on their calendar. When in fact, well, for me, what's the purpose of a company? Hopefully, building value, and building value requires time for deep work, for collaboration, for cooperation, for co-creation, and for leadership in particular. You need to have time to be creative, to connect the dots. And if you're always going from fire to meeting to documenting the meeting and the meeting minutes and being so rigorous with all these 30,000 frameworks, are we actually doing the right work to build value in these companies, or are we just having companies to have a bunch of processes that we can feel good about? So I think like there is that like meta conversation about what is the ultimate point of
Yes.
all these things.
Yes. Yes. You know what it's bringing up for me? Um, I was working as an employee at a company, and most of the employees were in Europe, and I'm in the U.S. And I'm a morning person. I am so freaking productive from 4 a.m. to about 9 a.m. And then my brain like slowly shuts down from the course of like 9
That's
a.m.
5 hours. That's a good amount of hours for you to be super productive, right?
It's okay. But I remember waking up feeling overwhelmed and behind every day because I woke up 6 hours behind. And it was a very heavy meeting culture, heavy, even in office culture for the employees who were in Europe. And then I would get into this cycle of just being in meetings all day, right? So, one, I had wasted my best brain time being in meetings. And then I was so tired by the end of the day, I had no time to actually think and process and do my work. And I remember saying to my boss, I can't get anything done. Like, I cannot get anything done. And he said, well, what does your calendar look like? Like, how are you spending your days? And he's like, when are you at your best? I'm like, the early morning. He goes, why are you spending all of your early mornings in meetings? I said, because that's my job. And he's like, no, it's not. Your job is to produce value. So what do you need to do? Perfect world, like wave a wand. What changes? And I was like, oh, I need like a day a week where I don't do meetings in the morning. And he's like, great, do that on your calendar, set an example. And then I had to do one other thing, Tomas, though. I had to work the system at home too, because I needed a weekend morning also. And I found that was the key, is if I could have a weekday morning and I could have a weekday morning, then I could handle that schedule. I could, I could thrive. But
Was a weekend morning for your personal life?
no, it was for
No,
work.
for work too. For
It
work,
was for
okay.
work. And so, like, that's not for everyone, but like, that was what I needed in order to like show up in an exec level job with a global team in a world that was pre-COVID. Now, post-COVID, it would maybe shift and change. But I think like that the lesson there to me was, how do you add value? You have to manage your energy and your time, and you have to like think about the system that can work for that.
Yeah. Joy, when you were working on those companies that are global, that are across time zones, what are some of the things that you find leaders are struggling with, and how do they deal with it?
Well, one thing that's very top of mind is probably a little bit of recency bias, but I was recently working with a team that it's a US based company, but I was doing a lot of work with their Australia and China teams. And we were talking about inclusion. And it was really interesting because I think there's so many like subtopics as you talk about inclusion, right? That's
Yes.
not it's not really the topic for today, but there's so many subtopics. And talking about inclusion in a global company in different regions is fascinating too. All the different topics that come up from that. But in Australia and China, actually, the first things that came up was time zone exclusion. And I was like, well, how does it show up? And they said, well, it shows up because every all hands is scheduled in US time. So anytime we're expected to come together as a whole team, it's in the middle of the night or the early morning or super late, whatever. And then they said things like, when people talk about it's summer here, like what a great kickoff to summer, just like the language. So one
Yes.
thing that's coming up around time zones is actually how exclusionary having meetings and synchronous communications that are time zone specific. And I don't think that's obviously intentional, but I think that goes back to like how important intentionality is from leaders now, is that they're thinking about anytime they're asking people to gather, what does that mean actually from their people. And one cool example to kind of overcome that or work through it, one manager said at the beginning of every meeting, we ask people in the chat to tell us what time it is and what they're drinking. And so people will be like, it's 2 a.m. here, and I'm drinking, to try to make it through this meeting. Or
Whiskey
it's
and Red Bull. Yeah.
whiskey and Red Bull. Yeah. And so just a little bit of like raising the awareness of what is the cost to gathering all of these people at all these different times.
It's so tough because once you get into 12 or more, even 10 or more hour difference, my conclusion has been somebody's going to burn out.
Yes.
It's just not going to be possible. And I remember a decade and a half when we had teams in Manila and India and everywhere else, it felt unfair. And the reflecting back on it and what I've been saying is, if you have a global company, the pendulum is going to be in one extreme, and it's not going to be possible to do everything with everybody. And so I don't know what the right answer is. So a few of the things is that you need to duplicate leadership in both time zones, or at least have leadership coverage, because it's not fair that if somebody is 12 hours ahead or behind, they're going to have potentially a 24-hour lag to give or get feedback or make a change. That's why you need somebody you can trust, that they can lead when you're asleep, or when the other team is asleep, and can take care of business, right? Can shepherd that value creation. And then the other thing is, how often should those people be getting together in person, right, to build those connections? Because if it's 3 a.m., you don't have a head to chat afterward or to do other things. You're thinking like from 10 p.m., from 4 p.m., you're stressed about the meeting you have 10 hours from now. So yeah, it's very difficult. I don't know what the right answer is, but do you have something that's working for how often should teams get together to feel cohesive?
It's interesting because it's still, I think, such a budget conversation that I'm seeing from company to company. Is you have some companies who are like, the number one line item on our budget, no matter what, is in-person gatherings, and we will prioritize that and we will make them happen. But I would say the majority, at least the ones I'm working with, are still budget constrained. And actually may even be getting messages like, yes, gather with your teams, but also be very conscious of the budget. So I think that there's actually there's a need for companies to just be more prescriptive about like how often teams can gather, how much they can spend, what it looks like. I think managers need more guardrails, and sometimes there can be a lot of freedom within the frame, but they need more of a frame, because it feels like oh, I can I have optionality here, but then I think there's some crippling of that, because they don't really know what the boundaries are, and they want to be company first and all those things. Also, I think some managers now don't really have the systems in place to be able to travel themselves. So it's a big constraint for them at home to be able to leave and travel across the country or even across the world to be able to see their people. So I would say just structure and clarity from the top around how and when we gather and what managers are able to do with their teams, and then enough notice of when that happens, so that people with obligations can actually plan ahead and make the arrangements. The ones that are gathering, here's what I'm seeing. I do a lot of work with leadership teams, and I'm seeing a big push for leadership teams to gather quarterly if they can, annually at the minimum, but to gather in person, to step away from the day to day, to build build trust, build that like tight system. But usually what they're doing is they're kind of combining in about 2 or 3 days, deep team building and trust building, strategic planning, and some like actual execution, which can be done, with the right planning and facilitation. I like to help with that. But they're really packing it in to make sure that the in-person experiences are high impact. I think the downside of that, a lot of companies are packing in high impact in-person work. And as you know, as I know, I don't think that as human beings we have the exact same capacity for in-person as we did 3 years ago. I use the example of myself. I would consider myself the most extreme extrovert. I went to Las Vegas for a conference in March, and by day 2, I was so exhausted. It was like a different level of intensity, right, of extroversion. So much so that Nelly was playing at this HR conference, which was weird but amazing, for free, and I did not go to the concert. I sat in my room and just like watched a movie and zoned out, right? So I think like the amount of time, the frequency we gather, the content that we focus on, again, that word intentional, I'm going to be a broken record with it, but you have to have so much thoughtfulness about when it is, where it is, what the experience is going to be like, in order to make sure that it's not too much and it's not enough, so that it's valuable. But I'm seeing a lot of really, really cool things in how companies are choosing to bring people together. And I think it's important, but I don't think it's as important as I used to. I feel like my team's an example. I think we've been able to build a ton of camaraderie and trust and loyalty, despite not being having an in-person experience very often.
Yes. Yeah, that resonates very strongly. There's people that I haven't met. There's so many companies that it can be 100% remote and never need to meet. It's really nice because you do
Mhm.
get exposed to full high definition 3D of that person. And I really liked what you said, and it's very well aligned to what I've also landed on. That is, if you're going to do in person gatherings, don't try to cram a bunch of work and try to make that hyper productive work. It was actually my co-founder and I, Alex.
Mhm.
Um, we were in the jungle in a creek talking about these things, and we were yeah, like just
Of
going
course you
going up
were.
a creek from the ocean on the Pacific Ocean, and we were talking about like, so what is the right framework? Like, do we get together and do all this strategy work? And I think the conclusion, he also pushed me hard, and I agree with him. It's no, it should be about the human side of things. The let's do activities, let's expose each other to, hey, what are the, yeah, the all the ingredients that make up this person, this team. And for me, it's been, let's get together and go for a hike for people that can do that, or let's go do some other activities. And sometimes it does feel a little bit forced
Mhm.
because it's like, forced team building. This is great,
Mhm.
but it does give you a lot more information. But I'm with
Yes.
you. I think that, do we really need it?
Mhm.
Maybe, maybe not. It's a nice to have, and it
Mhm.
definitely has a big payout.
Mhm.
And if you can afford it, great. And if not, maybe don't stress about it and be more intentional. Have more
Mhm.
time than you can, have a, I hate the term, the happy hour, but at least like a cup one or two times a week where you're seeing each other and you're not talking about work, and where you
Yes.
create the right culture that facilitates that.
Totally.
Yeah, I think it's
Totally.
completely possible. Joy, so I know we're running close to time, but two questions that I'd love to ask you. Like, why remote? Why is remote important? Right now, we're having this super polarized conversation of 80% of bosses want to go back into the office, and most workers that have tasted remote really don't want to go back into the office. Some do, but
Mhm.
maybe they don't want to go into the office all the time. So, why is remote important? Do we keep remote or do we not keep remote? And if we do keep remote, why? Why is remote important? Why do we care about it?
Mm. This is like one of those where you open the time capsule like 5 years later and you listen to this and you're like, oh, what was our perspective? Like, I
Yeah,
wish
yeah,
we could
yeah.
fast forward time. It's interesting because I actually work with a lot. I work with, I think, a very balanced blend of companies when it comes to their perspective on this. Some are completely obsessed with being in person. Many are hybrid, many are remote. So I'm going to try to actually bring my very own perspective versus that of all of my clients. Why is remote important? I'm going to use myself as an example. I am I'm doing work that I never thought was possible from a location I never thought was possible, and I'm thriving. So I think that's just the pure selfish answer is I was able to make changes in my life for my family. I was able to build and run a business from a place that I want to be. And I'm able to reach so many more people than and companies and have a bigger impact than if I was beholden to places I could drive to, walk to, fly to. So that's my personal why. I think we were talking about inclusion earlier, but I've now have all these people, all these examples in my head that float around, right? And I'm sure you do too, of just how much is possible because of remote work for all these different people at different stages of their life in different ways. And I think about one person on my team who is like the definition of a hustler. Like if you saw hustle in the dictionary, this young person is going places and has more work ethic than ever I thought possible. And she is not only working full time for a company fully remote, but she's also working 20 hours a week for me remote. And she's able to do that because she's completely managed by results in both places. And I think like it's such an example of she's achieving way more financial freedom and time freedom at 23 years old because she's able to design her work and her life in a way that she can actually do two jobs and do two jobs really well. So I think there's so many examples of that, and we have to like pay attention to why remote is important and why remote is working, not just for like the working moms like me, but for a lot of different people at a lot of different stages who it works for them for different reasons. Now, the other part of your question, Tomas, about why not or why isn't it working or what should we just abandon it? I think we're in the middle of the change curve where you're kind of at the bottom for some people and it feels really hard. I always picture the change curve like you're in a swimming pool and you kind of get to the bottom of the change curve and you're at the bottom of the pool. I think some people are like drowning and they're like just waiting for someone to like dive in and pull them up and say, don't worry, you can just come back to the office. It's okay. I think other people are like, treading water and needing help. But I think there's a lot of leaders and companies who are like, I don't really know how to do this well. This
Yes.
isn't working for me. Therefore, the only option must be to go back instead of what might the options be to move forward, but differently. And so I feel like we're just kind of at that juncture moment. That's at least my 2 cents.
It's hard.
It's hard.
There are a lot of things to think about. And as you were mentioning that it's privilege for us, like we get to live in crazy places and have a lifestyle. There's also days that suck, right?
Yeah.
For you, for me, it's like some days it's hard. Today's a good day,
Yeah.
but it's difficult, and you definitely have to be intentional about our own working sanity, having a good space where you don't get interrupted, where you feel like you can be productive. And it's difficult because we take it for granted. We've
Yes.
been doing remote before the pandemic. We were exposed to these ideas, and so we're just like, okay, yeah, it's the same. But you forget. I was in a meeting the other day, and they were still sending attachments for documents. They didn't know about Google Doc or Microsoft 365 or Notion or all these things where you can collaborate with comments. And I had to teach them, and it was such a beautiful reminder to not take all of that for granted. And that's why we're here, because it's difficult. You have to think about people and presence and communication and documentation and supporting and different personalities and inclusion. And when we were in an office asking people to burn gas and spend 1 to 2 hours in their car so we could keep them in the little corral, it was easier.
Yeah.
Now it's harder. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
so it's exciting, but I like that. So many people are our teams are floundering, and we've floundered, and so it's nice that we get to share this knowledge. Joy, any questions or topics that we didn't cover in the last few minutes?
Oh, well, I feel like the next time we talk, we should talk about building psychological safety in a remote world. But it's too much to take on.
I'd like some psychological safety in the remote world.
Well, I think you gave me an example of it the other day when you said, I don't know if I'm feeling up for this. Like you were feeling sick and you're like, I want to be on my A game. I feel like even you sharing that vulnerability made me feel safe that if I'm ever like not feeling great, I could absolutely call you and say, hey, let's take a rain check. Let's do this later. So I feel like one key tip is just like being honest and authentic and showing our vulnerability is like a really good step towards building psychological safety and building trust.
100%. It's one of the things I love about remote is that we actually get a tiny window into what makes up this person. And if they have a child or a dog, things are going to happen, and we need to be okay with that.
Absolutely.
It's a trade-off, but we get that connection to the deeper human than just somebody that's always going to be very well made up and show up even if things are exploding outside. I think this also gives us a better chance to be more fulfilled, to have a more fulfilled existence. And we'll talk about what's the purpose of working and fulfillment, because we're privileged that we get to love what we do.
It's 100% true. And this is so fun. Thank you.
Cool. Joy, if people are interested, where do they find you for coaching, for all the great leadership work that you do? Where can people engage more with what Joy does?
Find me on LinkedIn, Joy Sybesma, Sybesma. It's kind of a mouthful. Or joy@scalejoy.net via email is probably the best places. And I'm just excited to keep learning from you, Tomas, and from all of your work. I really appreciate the time.
Joy, likewise. It's always so fun to talk to you, and we'll leave those links. All right, Joy. Thank you very much. Good to see you.
Thank you.
All right.
Are we done?
We're done.